Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I thought we'd look at how can we use VBA to create a blank Microsoft Access database. Now, obviously, this typically is something you're thinking that would be used in Access, yes, but the code could technically be used in other applications. So let's dive in. Let's see how simple this is, because it really is quite simple once you know how. If you look here on the screen currently, I have my article up. So you can go there, you can scroll through it. The way it's set up basically is I start off with a simple example, then I go below a more advanced example, and below that an even more advanced example. Lastly, I have a link here to the critical piece of this entire scenario, and we're going to examine that right now. So let's start off with the simplest of examples. So just creating a basic blank database, not doing anything else. All we're going to do is create the file. So if we want to create a blank database, well, the critical piece to this puzzle is this guy here. It's all done with the create database method. As I said, there's a link at the bottom. If we go to it, you'll see here, let me scroll back up for a second, that this method accepts 3 input arguments. So the name, the file that you want to create, so path and file name. The locale, which type of locale should this database be created with, and then various options. And if you check here, you'll see very quickly they explain a couple things about the locale. They explain here about password. So I didn't invent any of this stuff. I just read the documentation and pieced it together and created a function that I could use. And then various options. Okay, so the locale, as you see here, we have different options available to us. Now, in my code, I've set it to use the dblang general, okay, because this is the one that will satisfy most people's needs, not necessarily everyone's, but most. So note that if this collation here doesn't apply to you, you need a different one. Well, then all you have to do is switch out wherever I put dblang with whichever one you need to use. So I don't know, Korean, if you just switch out where I put dblang general and switch it to dblang Korean. If you're doing traditional Chinese, I'll switch it over to language Chinese traditional. And then below here we have the different possible options that we can put together. And they even say that you can sum them together. So they explain here, as you can see, you've got different options here for formatting, which file format to use to create. So do you want to create an ACCDB? Do you want to create an MDB? If it is an MDB, are we talking a 2003, a 2000, a 97? What, database file format do you want? And there's also an option here for encrypt. And that works in combination with, obviously, a password. So, like I say, the documentation is actually quite complete. So take a look at it if anything isn't clear. So let's go back to what have I done? Well, I've hard-coded here, like I said, dblang general. And there's a reason for that. Sadly, it's not possible to create an argument for the language. So it's something I'm going to explore further, but there's a limitation. I was a little surprised. If you try to do it, you actually get an error that Microsoft Visual Basic doesn't support it, which floors my mind because we're able to use it in the method, but yet we can't use it if we create our own function. It's a little odd, but something I will try to explore a little further because it would make this function 100% basically flexible, and that way you wouldn't have this hard-coded and it would be another input argument. But regardless, let's get back to what I have here. The function, the way it is organized. It takes 3 input arguments, 2 of which are optional. So the only thing that you absolutely have to give is the file. So you have to give it a path and file name for the database that you're about to create. So very simple, C2 points, temp, and then you give it a name, mydatabase.accdb. And if you look above, I give you some examples here. Okay, that's why I always have a usage section in my headers. It's to show you different possible, code examples that you can use to run this. And I try to explain, like here, this one would give you an unencrypted ACDB. This one would give you an encrypted ACCDB with the password 123. This would give you an unencrypted MDB. So just showing you different flavors of how the command can be used. Now let's look at the actual function. How is it all put together? The two optional arguments are the format, the file format, and whether we're encrypting, whether we're applying a password. And then you just come down here, we're going to create a new instance of access so we can work with. And then we look here. Did the user specify the file format? So did he tell me that this was, an ACTB or an MDB, what version, yes or no? Well, if we're here at it equals 0, it means they didn't supply anything. And what you're going to notice here is I won't specify a format here, we'll just use the default. Next, then I look here, did the user supply a password? So if there is no string value, it's an empty string, that means no password is specified, so we're not going to put one either. But in the case that one was supplied, then we're going to have to add here the string password equals, well, semicolon password equal, and then whatever the password was that the user supplied to us. And we have to supply the option of DB encrypt. So that's in the case of no format being specified. In the case that a format was applied, then we also then check was a password supplied, just like we did above. But this time, since a DB format was supplied, we're going to specify it in our options. So it's the exact same thing, except here we're adding now that option of the format that was specified. And the same thing in the case of a password. Now we're going to take the DB format and we're going to also put the DB encrypt options. Okay, so there are two options that we're using together now. And then we come down and it's just going to return true, because basically if it's run through all of this successfully without an error, then it created the database for us. And then here we exit by doing a bit of spring cleaning, house cleaning. We're going to check, is the instance of access running? If it is, then we're going to quit it, and then we're going to clear out our variable. Should ever an error occur, because we have our error handler here, then it will kick out and spit out a nice message for us that hopefully we can decipher. So that's the simple approach. Let's just keep going down for a little bit. I just wanted to demonstrate. I tested out, because originally I was just using this command directly. Okay, I didn't have a function, right? I built the function after doing different tests. I just wanted to illustrate a little bit here as to what the different options result in depending on different versions. Now, I did 2 quick tests. Maybe I'll do more. Again, access 2007, 2010, maybe even go back. But I just wanted to illustrate here very quickly that if you just do the default, so create a file dblang in 2013, it creates 168 kilobyte ACCDB. If you then, instead of that, you use the version 40, which is an MDB, and as it says here, JET 4.0 MDB, you'll get a 76 kilobyte database as an MDB. If you try any other version earlier, so you're trying to do an MDB in 2097, it will not work. Okay, you always get an error here about the ISAM, okay, every single time. Similarly, just to illustrate, if you go and you try and access 365, first of all, you get more options for DB versions because the ACCDB has evolved over time. Okay, since 2016, 2019, 2021, the file format, even though it's still an ACCDB, has evolved. And that's why you'll see here all sorts of different versions. So you got the version 120, 140, 150, 167. And as you can see, if you do nothing by default, it generates 2007 to 2013 ACCDB. But if you use any of the others, it generates a 2007 to 2016 ACCDB. So just note that if you use the version 40, so you're trying to create an MDB, once again, it will work. But if you try any of the earlier versions, it will not. It will fail with the exact same error as the 2013. So I just wanted to illustrate that although you have available to all these options, they may not necessarily work, depending on the version of access you are running when you run the command, because not all versions are backwards compatible with old versions of access. So just keep that in mind. If you really do need to create old versions, then you have to have an old version of access. Okay, moving on. Like I said, the first example was the simple one. Now we're going to move on, because I mentioned here originally in the article, it stopped here. I just mentioned that we could do other things, change properties, add references, etc. So I wanted to just demonstrate how easy that could be done. And this is where the second version of the same function. So all of this we're familiar with, okay? This is unchanged. So it's the same thing, the same arguments that we call, and we'll create the database based on whatever we've chosen, DB format and password. But where it changes now is I wanted to demonstrate that we can, at the same time that we create this database, set database properties. So we can set pretty much any property we want. It's just a question of knowing how. So I wanted to demonstrate that. So as you can see here, I've got this section with the ODB, so that I've now created an object here that I'm assigning the created database to. So then we can use that object and work with it to then create properties. So as you can see here, I create a property app title, so the title of the application, and you have to tell it what type of information it is. So in this case, it's a text entry, and I'm assigning a value of new database via VBA. Then here I have another one that I create. Sorry, I should step back. So I create the property here, and then next I append it to the database object. Okay, so I create the property and then I append it. So I add it to it. Next, I create a new property and then I append that one. I create a new property, I append it. So you see how it works over and over and over. So here, as you can see, the perform name autocorrect, I'm disabling. I'm setting it to false. 0 is false. Track name autocorrect, I'm setting that to false. Autocompact, the compact on close, I set that to false. The design with data, which is actually enable layout views, I'm disabling that. Here, use MDI mode. So as you can see here, do you want to use tab documents or do you want to use overlap windows, which is a choice that you'd make. I'm choosing to use the old style overlap. I'm setting it to 1. Right? 1 is overlap. And lastly but not least, I shouldn't say lastly but not least, but here I'm setting the allow data sheets schema, which is enable design change for tables in data sheet view. I'm setting that to false. And lastly, I'm removing personal information whenever it's saved. Remove personal information from file on save. I'm setting that to true. So just a bunch of different properties here that I'm setting. There are others. They're all accessible to us. I'm just using these as a demonstration. And so it will do that with the database object, and then we will exit and close everything down. And then I moved on, and like I said here, you could push things further, create tables, relationships. So I just wanted to illustrate a little bit some of that. So now we're going to retake the exact original function. So now you're familiar with all of this, creating the database. You're familiar with the properties. So here I'm just illustrating a couple other things we can do. I come here to create a table. And as you can see, I'm going to use SQL to do it. We could use DAO, but it's more complex, a lot more code. And for typical simple tables, we don't need to go to that extreme. So I just create my SQL command here. So it's a create table, the name of my table, and now I start defining different fields. As you can see here, it's a text 10, text 255, text 255. If it's null, not null, here it's counter primary key, so auto number, and I apply a constraint. It's just one example of many. And here I come and I'm using that database object. I'm executing my SQL command with a db fail on error. So that will effectively create that table for me. Next, I want to demonstrate, well, what if we want to populate that table? Well, then it's just a question of doing an insert into. So I'm going to build an SQL command for that. Insert into my table name, the field names, and then the values I want to assign to each of those fields. And once again, I use the execute with the SQL with db fail on error. I do that twice to make 2 entries in my table. Lastly, just to demonstrate once again how we could create a query. Well, once again, I'm going to define the SQL of the query, whatever I want it to be. In this case, I'm going to select the top, the first entry in my table when it's ordered by object name. And then all I have to use is my DB object here, and I'm going to use create query def. I will give it a name, so the name of the query I'm creating, and I will pass it the SQL that I want it to have. That's it. Once again, if we make it all the way through this without any problems, well, then everything worked perfectly. I'll return the function, will return a true value, so the user knows or can validate that it ran properly, and we just do some cleanup. Lastly, in the article, I just mentioned here, keep things simple. I've just demonstrated that obviously we can do all of this through VBA. It is glorious. You've got a lot of power under the hood. You already knew that. VBA is incredible. But at the end of the day, sometimes, we don't need to necessarily overcomplicate our lives. Now, yes, this works. There's nothing wrong with it. And then if it makes you happy, go for it. But sometimes there are simpler approaches. And the approach I've typically taken historically, if I really need to work with a blank database to build out exports and things like that, I'll simply store a blank database in the folder of the database, or I'll have a subfolder where I'll store it. And then when I need it, I just simply copy it. Okay, so now instead of all of this code, I can just do a file copy, one line, and I'm done. But this gives you 100% flexibility versus the copy. It is whatever it is when you copy it. There's also another option, and like I say, I can't believe I'm actually suggesting it, but because empty databases are very small, you could technically even add it as an attachment in the database. So then you don't even have external files floating around in the database folder or wherever. It's part of the database itself, and you could extract it and copy it wherever you need it to be in runtime. So that would be another possible option that could be possibly simpler than this approach. So once again, the choice is yours. Let's quickly take a look at this in function. I have a blank database. You'll see here, you should recognize this code, very simple. It's the last code sample that does absolutely everything. Creates the database, sets the properties, creates a table, adds entries to the table, creates a query. Just to demonstrate that this does work, in fact, I'm going to take this sample code that I have here. I will put it here. So what am I doing? I'm going to create the database in the same path location as the current database. You change this to whatever you want, wherever you want it to be. I'm giving it the name of newdb.accdb. And I'm telling it to give it to me as version 150. Let's see what happens. So it will run. We get true. I'm going to now open up my file browser and I'm going to go get the example, and I will open it for us to explore. And here we go. And as you can see, it created a table and a query. If we open the table quickly, there are two entries, exactly like I said it would be. And if you run the query, it goes and gets the first one based on the object name. So if we look at our source table, form 1, report 1, well, it would go get form 1. So the query works properly, and if you want to validate, you can go into design view, check out the SQL. It is exactly what we sent to it. You can also validate the different properties by going into your options. And if you go under current database, you'll see that new database file VBA, exactly like I said. I chose overlapping. I disabled close on compact. I added the remove personal information. I disabled layout view, design changes. So as you can see, all of this is accessible to you. I disabled here the name autocorrect options, etc., etc., etc. So all of this is you can control when you're creating your database with ease. It's very simple. It's a line or two. And that's literally it. But what I will demonstrate to you, one quick thing, and why there is this comment here in the code, is if we try to run this again, we're going to get an error. Database already exists. So just a word of caution, and as you can see, it returned a false value, so the function did not succeed. Before running this, so you can either before actually calling the function, or if you want part of the actual function here, you could add some code to validate if the file that the person is requesting already exists, and then prompt the user, do you want to overwrite it, yes or no? If they say yes, you can issue the kill command. If not, well, then you just exit without doing anything. So just one extra thing that perhaps you want to consider. That's why I added the comment. I'm leaving that choice. how you want to handle it, if you want to handle it, or you just want to report an error as I currently am doing. But as you can see, it really is very simple. The sky is the limit here. You can continue pushing this forward and doing all sorts of other things and building a new blank database to suit your exacting needs. So I hope this has been a little informative and helps some of you understand how you go about this. It really isn't very hard here, you know that. And we will see you in the next video. Thank you once again for watching my videos, and have a great end of day, guys.